I want to devote the final portion of the final lecture for the term to revisiting Gettier cases, using the Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich article as a jump-off point for discussing the structure of these Gettier cases. We want to talk about the evidential basis that Gettier cases purport to provide for the conclusion that justified true belief is insufficient for knowledge. Specifically, we'll identify two different intuitions that must be cultivated by different aspects of the Gettier case vignette. We'll see that this creates a tension between internalistic perspectives on the evidence and externalistic perspectives on the evidence, and that this leads to an asymmetry in formulating Gettier cases between internalist theories and externalist theories. We'll then recapitulate some of the major themes that emerge during the course in talking about whether this tension that the Gettier cases reveal can be resolved within the traditional epistemological framework. We'll note that traditional epistemology formulates theories about the nature of knowledge that are definitional in structure. They specify individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for a belief to count as knowledge. We'll note, too, that the primary explanandum, the phenomenon that epistemologists focus most of their attention upon, the things that they want most fundamentally to explain, are individual acts of knowledge creation, forming beliefs in isolated contexts for specific reasons. There's a secondary emphasis on isolated use of knowledge in certain circumstances, for instance, using knowledge to categorize objects. There's also a secondary emphasis on the evidential relationships between individual beliefs within an overall knowledge structure, and that these are the primary phenomena that epistemologists seek to understand and explain using their definitional theories of knowledge. We'll add this final piece that we introduced in this last article, the methodology that traditional epistemology relies on primarily in trying to explain this phenomenon with their definitional theories, specifically the elicitation of intuitive categorization judgments to thought experiments encapsulated in specific vignettes. Gettier cases try to generate two intuitive categorization judgments, offering this combination of judgments as evidence against the definitional theory of knowledge as justified true belief. Both of these intuitions must be elicited by a particular vignette in order to provide evidence for the thesis that justified true belief proves insufficient for knowledge. It is a common mischaracterization, however, of Gettier's paper that he in fact quote-unquote shows that justified true belief fails to count as knowledge, or that the protagonist in the cases is justified and fails to know. Gettier cases elicit these intuitions in many, but clearly not all, people who encounter them, and this is the extent of their evidence. There is no definitive demonstration in the way that we might see a definitive demonstration of an empirical matter of fact. Each intuition that a Gettier case generates requires attending to certain features of the vignette and ignoring other features of the vignette. The first intuition, call it the Smith intuition, requires that one adopt the protagonist's perspective and ignore the backstory. That is, you want to adopt Smith's perspective of the scenario. Think about whether or not Smith is justified in his belief given his evidence and his perception of the situation. In doing so, you ignore the backstory about the defects in Smith's evidence. Only when you adopt the protagonist's perspective in a Gettier vignette can you cultivate the intuition that the protagonist is in fact justified. Thus, the Smith intuition is like the intuition that one would have from within the matrix when one believes that there is a spoon. The second intuition, let's call it the neo-intuition, requires that one adopt the perspective of the backstory. That is, one generates an intuition about whether or not Smith knows by taking into account the defects in Smith's evidence. Only when one adopts the perspective of the backstory can one cultivate the intuition that the protagonist does not know in these Gettier vignettes. Only by escaping the matrix can you believe that there is no spoon. Notice, from the perspective of the backstory, the protagonist is not justified. Likewise, from the protagonist's perspective, the belief intuitively counts as knowledge. Thus, the intuitive judgments upon which Gettier relies only emerge from these vignettes because of a tension between the internalist perspective of the protagonist and the externalist perspective of the backstory. As a result, one might suppose that there are no Gettier-type cases for externalist theories like reliabilist theories of justification or reliabilist theories of knowledge, in that externalist theories explicitly discount the internalist perspective. And in some sense, you are right. However, discrimination cases, like the zebra case that is mentioned in Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich, do have a somewhat similar structure. For instance, in one version, the protagonist employs a generally reliable process in circumstances that constitute a local violation of its underlying presuppositions. We'll discuss cases like that and the problems that they pose for reliabilist theories in the final lecture module.